Hey guys, tonight's story begins somewhere deeply unequipped for pharmaceutical responsibility. A place that probably shouldn't have been selling anything capable of reorganizing a human nervous system. A gas station, fluorescent lights, burnt coffee, a rotating hot dog that may have been there since the Obama administration. Someone arguing with a lottery machine at 3 a.m, while a country song plays quietly above the refrigerators, and somewhere beside the energy shots and nicotine gummies, a little bottle called ZaZa Red. It promised mood support, relaxation, mental clarity, the kind of language usually associated with supplements your aunt recommends after discovering a podcast about toxins. Except this one worked a little differently. People started taking it before work, then during work, then just to feel normal enough to answer a text message without their hands shaking. And the strangest part of this story is that almost nobody realised what they were taking, because hidden inside those convenience store capsules was a drug originally developed in France as an antidepressant that quietly started behaving a lot more like an opioid. Not heroin exactly, not legally classified like heroin anyway, but close enough that people across America would eventually nickname it something deeply absurd and deeply accurate: Station Heroin. By the early 2000s, the United States had a problem it had largely created for itself. Decades of aggressive opioid prescribing, pain pills handed out in quantities that outpaced any plausible medical need, distributed through a pharmaceutical supply chain that was paid by volume, had produced a population of people who were dependent on substances their doctors could no longer legally give them. When the prescriptions dried up, some people stopped, many didn't. They found heroin, which was cheaper and easier to obtain than anyone in public health had anticipated. Then fentanyl arrived in the supply, and the death count started climbing in ways that made the previous decade look like a warning that had not been heeded. Into that landscape, into that specific American combination of widespread pain, collapsed trust in the medical system, and a population of people actively searching for something that worked and was accessible and was not going to get them arrested, came a category of products that the law had, in 1994, made very difficult to regulate. The Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was passed after sustained lobbying by the supplement industry and signed by President Clinton. Its core provision was structural. Dietary supplements did not require pre-market safety approval from the FDA. Pharmaceutical drugs had to demonstrate safety and efficacy before being sold. Supplements went on the shelf first, and the FDA could act only after harm was documented. The burden of proof ran backwards. The supplement industry considered this a victory for consumer freedom. It was also, more practically, a vacancy sign for anyone with a foreign pharmaceutical compound and access to a label printer. The compound that found that category has a name that sounds like the antagonist in a legal thriller: Tianeptine. It was discovered and patented in the 1960s by the French Society of Medical Research, a body that sounds more august than it probably was, but which in this case produced something that genuinely worked. For decades after its development, nobody fully understood why it worked. It was classed as an atypical tricyclic antidepressant, which is a way of saying it didn't fit neatly into any of the existing categories. It didn't block serotonin reuptake the way Prozac did. It did something different, something that looked, at least in clinical trials, like genuine relief from depression and anxiety, with fewer side effects than the alternatives. France approved it for medical use in 1983 under the brand name Stablon. Servier, the pharmaceutical company that manufactured it, eventually carried it into more than 60 countries across Europe, Asia and Latin America, where it was prescribed under names like Coaxil and Tatinol. The standard dose was 12.5 milligrams taken 3 times a day. Small, closely monitored, with a short half-life that meant it cleared the body quickly. When used at that dose, by patients under a doctor's care, it helped people. That version of the drug's life is not the version this story is about, but it matters that it existed, because the gap between the drug that French physicians were prescribing in 1983 and the product sold in an Ohio gas station in 2023 is not just a dosage question. It is the entire story. For many years, one of tianeptine's stranger qualities was that nobody knew precisely how it produced its effects. It wasn't activating the serotonin system in any conventional way. Researchers proposed different mechanisms, ran different trials, published different explanations. The drug kept working, and kept not quite fitting the frameworks available to describe it. Then, roughly a decade ago, a team of researchers, including Jonathan Javich at Columbia University, identified what was actually happening. Tianeptine, it turned out, was a full agonist at the Mu-Opioid receptor. Javich later described this as a huge surprise. The drug had been prescribed to hundreds of thousands of patients across 60 countries for 30 years, and the mechanism had simply never been looked for in the right place. In pharmacology, as in most things, it helps to ask the question. The mu-opioid receptor is the same receptor targeted by morphine, by oxycodone, by heroin. Tianeptine was binding to it and activating it, which explained the antidepressant effects. Opioid receptor activation has legitimate antidepressant properties, a fact that was actually understood centuries before the relevant neuroscience existed, and it explained a few other things too. Things that people in France had been noticing since at least the early 2000s. Patients were doctor shopping for tianeptine, obtaining multiple prescriptions from multiple physicians simultaneously, which is a behaviour with one standard explanation. In 2005, France added addiction warnings to the Stablin patient leaflet. In 2011, the National Narcotics and Psychotropics Committee found what it described as persisting cases of tianeptine abuse and drug dependence, and requested a full benefit-risk reassessment. The reassessment concluded that tianeptine remained therapeutically useful, but barely. The benefit-risk ratio was, in the language of the report, favourable but limited. In September of 2012, France reclassified it. Prescriptions were capped at 28 days. Dispensing rules were tightened. Russia, Armenia, Ukraine and Turkey followed with their own controlled substance classifications. Georgia simply withdrew it from the market. Tianeptine's medical career in Europe was, by the early 2010s, a heavily supervised and increasingly restricted one. The drug had not been pulled from use, but it had been placed behind enough gates that obtaining it for non-medical purposes required genuine effort. In the United States, none of this happened, because none of this could happen, because none of it was necessary. Tianeptine had never been approved for medical use in the United States in the first place. The FDA had reviewed it and declined to approve it, partly because of exactly the concerns that Europe was now acting on, and partly because there were already plenty of approved antidepressants on the market and the bar for demonstrating meaningful clinical advantage was high. There was a brief attempt to develop a once-daily formulation for the US market, with clinical trials begun in 2009. Those trials were discontinued in January of 2012 for reasons that were never publicly specified. So tianeptine was not in the United States. Not approved, not prescribed, not sold. The FDA did not need to restrict a drug it had never permitted. The DEA did not need to schedule a substance it had no reason to monitor. There were no rules about tianeptine in America because officially tianeptine was not an American problem, which meant, among other things, that nothing was stopping someone from importing it in bulk, putting it in a capsule, and placing it on a shelf next to the energy drinks. That is what happened. Tianeptine was not a dietary ingredient in any coherent sense. The FDA would eventually say explicitly that it was not, that it did not qualify, that it was an unapproved drug being illegally marketed. But the FDA saying so, and the FDA being able to stop it were different problems, and the second one proved considerably harder to solve. By the mid-2010s, products containing tianeptine were appearing in gas stations and convenience stores across the American South. Capsules, bottles of 15 or 20 pills, labelled as cognitive enhancers, mood boosters, brain function supplements. The label was not lying exactly, in the sense that tianeptine did affect brain function. It was simply declining to specify which receptors were involved. The dose was not 12.5 milligrams. A single capsule in many of these products contained 150 milligrams, 12 times the standard therapeutic amount. A single bottle contained 15 or 20 of them. Anyone who purchased one bottle and followed their own instincts about how much to take could consume, in a single purchase, roughly 3,000 milligrams of a Mu-Opioid receptor agonist, bought without a prescription, without a warning, without anyone asking their name. France had a pharmacist and a 28-day prescription limit. The United States had a clerk at a gas station and a shelf, and the general understanding that things sold legally next to the ibuprofen were probably fine. They were not fine. The pharmacological gap between the drug Servier sold under medical supervision in Paris and the supplements sold in a Georgia convenience store was not a matter of degree. It was a different drug experience entirely. The same compound, deployed at doses that transformed its mechanism from antidepressant to opioid agonist, available to anyone with $15 and proximity to a highway exit. The first poison control cases involving Tianeptine in the United States began appearing around 2000, though only 11 total were recorded in the entire 13-year period between 2000 and 2013. A small signal, easy to miss. Then the retail products arrived in force. 5 cases in 2014, 81 in 2017, 151 in 2020 alone. The CDC documented the acceleration and described Tianeptine as a possible emerging public health risk, which is the kind of language regulatory agencies use when they have noticed a problem and are not yet sure how far their authority extends to address it. By that point, the people selling Tianeptine products had been operating for years inside the space between what the FDA knew and what the FDA could do. The FDA could warn, it could write letters, it could say, in official language, that these products were being illegally marketed, that Tianeptine was not a dietary supplement, that people were being harmed. What it could not do, because DSHEA did not give it the power, was walk into a gas station in Alabama and take a bottle off the shelf before that bottle injured someone. Dr. Peter Cohen, an associate professor at Harvard Medical School who studies supplement regulation, described it clearly. There are now, he said, at least a dozen different products that are foreign drugs being openly marketed as dietary supplements right under the FDA's eyes, without them being able to stop the sales. The president of the United Natural Products Alliance, an industry trade group that did not itself sell Tianeptine and would eventually call for its removal, put it with a different kind of directness. We can persuade, he said. We can encourage. We can inform. But we can't regulate. That admission, from within the supplement industry itself, is worth pausing on. The system was functioning exactly as designed, and the design had a structural limitation that even its defenders were willing to name. A foreign-approved pharmaceutical compound, reclassified as narcotic in Europe, was being sold at highway gas stations in the United States as a dietary supplement, and the mechanism that was supposed to protect American consumers from exactly this kind of situation had essentially a sign on the door that said we'll deal with it after. What came after is where this story goes next. The transaction itself was unremarkable. A counter, a bottle, $15. Maybe the person standing there had a specific reason. Back pain that wasn't going away, a stretch of anxiety that had become hard to manage, a job that felt impossible to face on a bad morning. Maybe they didn't have a particular reason at all, just saw the bottle on the shelf and read the label and thought, mood support. That sounds like something I could use. Maybe a friend had mentioned it. Maybe they'd read about it online, in one of the forums where people discussed it with the measured enthusiasm of people who have found something that works and aren't sure how long it will last. In any case, counter, bottle, $15. No consultation, no pharmacist, no documentation of what they were taking, or at what dose, or whether they were taking anything else that might interact with it. The transaction had no more ceremony than a pack of gum. They took it home. And for a while, sometimes for several weeks, it worked. The people who ended up dependent on Tianeptine did not form a single demographic. They were not a population that could be easily described. What they shared was not income or age or geography, but a narrower thing. They had found their way to a product that offered relief from something, and the relief had worked, and then the relief had become a problem that was harder to solve than the original one. Some came from the direction of depression and anxiety. People who had tried prescribed antidepressants and found them slow or ineffective or inaccessible because they didn't have health insurance, and a doctor's appointment cost what the gas station bottle cost several times over. These users often found Tianeptine through nootropics forums, online communities devoted to cognitive enhancement and pharmacological self-optimization, which is a way of describing people who read research abstracts and take notes. Tianeptine had a legitimate clinical record. It had been prescribed by doctors in Europe for 4 decades. The fact that it hadn't been approved in the United States read, to some in these communities, as regulatory caution rather than a warning sign. It was in the same mental category as certain vitamins, something the medical establishment hadn't gotten around to endorsing yet. What those communities described in the early weeks of use was striking. Mood elevation, reduced anxiety, something they described as a clean effect, not the blunted quality some people associate with conventional antidepressants, not a high, just a functional improvement in how they felt and moved through their days. Some Reddit users described it as the most effective antidepressant they had ever taken. Some said it had given them their lives back. The nootropics community gave Tianeptine an intellectual cover story that it would carry for years. These were not, by self-description, drug users. They were optimizers. They read the European pharmacological literature. They discussed half-lives and receptor binding profiles and the relative merits of different dosing schedules. Tianeptine had a real clinical record, decades of European prescription data, peer-reviewed trials, a recognized mechanism. The fact that it hadn't been approved in the United States was, in these forums, treated as a feature of American regulatory conservatism rather than a signal about the compound's safety profile. This framing was not entirely wrong. The US had declined to approve many legitimate European medications. What the framing missed was that Tianeptine's European career had by then included a narcotic reclassification that the nootropics community was not, in the main, discussing. That part was real. Tianeptine at low doses does produce those effects. The clinical trials in Europe were not fabricated. The antidepressant and anxiolytic properties are genuine. The problem was not that the drug lied about what it could do. The problem was that the drug didn't mention what came next. Others came from the direction of opioids. The American opioid crisis had, by the mid-2010s, produced a specific population of people who needed pain management or mood management, and had been told by every legitimate avenue that their options were limited. Former opioid users who had been in recovery and were looking for something that would help without reinstating their addiction. People who had been cut off from pain prescriptions when the guidelines tightened and were trying to manage conditions that hadn't improved just because the prescriptions had stopped. The marketing on some Tianeptine products spoke directly to this group. Some products were explicitly advertised as a legal way to manage opioid cravings, a natural alternative to substances that had gotten out of hand. It was, from a certain angle, almost plausible. A legal supplement, available at a gas station, that could take the edge off. What those users did not know, what almost none of the people buying Tianeptine at gas stations knew, was that the substance they were taking to manage their relationship with opioids was itself an opioid agonist. Different in its exact receptor binding profile from the drugs they were trying to leave behind, but functionally similar enough that it would produce dependence in the same way, on a similar timeline, with withdrawal symptoms that looked almost identical to what they had already been through once. For some of these users, Tianeptine didn't replace the addiction. It became one. The third group was pain. People with chronic conditions, back injuries, fibromyalgia, nerve damage, who'd been managing with over-the-counter medications and found them increasingly insufficient. Gas station Tianeptine was cheap. It was accessible. At the doses being sold, it had opioid-like analgesic properties. It worked for pain in the same way it worked for mood, because it was, at those doses, acting like an opioid. The label said mood support. In practice, for this group, it was pain management. Same gap between the label and the mechanism, same direction of travel. The pharmacology of what happened next is worth understanding, because it explains why the trap closed so quickly and so completely. Tianeptine has a short half-life. Most of the compound is cleared from the body within 12 hours. This is why the European prescription was structured as 3 doses per day, morning, midday, evening, to maintain therapeutic levels throughout the day. At therapeutic doses, this rhythm is manageable. The medication does its work, clears, is replaced by the next dose, and the person's experience of their day is relatively stable. At the doses being sold in American gas stations, the rhythm accelerated. A capsule containing 150 milligrams, 12 times the therapeutic amount, hit the opioid receptors harder and more immediately. The effect was more pronounced. It was also shorter. The half-life doesn't change with dose. A larger amount clears at the same rate as a smaller one. So the effect rises faster and falls faster, and the fall begins to carry something the therapeutic dose doesn't: the early onset of withdrawal. The body's response to opioid receptor agonism is, over time, to recalibrate. Receptors that are being consistently activated begin to downregulate. They become less sensitive, requiring more stimulation to produce the same response. This is tolerance, and it is not specific to illegal drugs or even to opioids. It is a standard feature of pharmacology. What makes opioid tolerance particularly efficient is that it develops quickly, and that its inverse, the absence of the drug, produces symptoms that are not merely the return of the original condition, but something actively worse. A new set of symptoms generated by the recalibrated nervous system suddenly operating without the stimulus it had come to expect. Anxiety, agitation, muscle pain, restless legs, sweating, nausea, vomiting, elevated heart rate, insomnia. The full inventory of opioid withdrawal beginning within hours of the last dose. A Tianeptine user at, say, 6 months of use and significant dose escalation would typically begin feeling the first symptoms of withdrawal within 3 to 6 hours of their last capsule. That window tightens as the dose increases. Dawn Solly, a clinical toxicologist and director of a Florida poison control center, described what she was seeing in her patients. People develop a tolerance very quickly, she said, and so they rapidly start advancing the dosing. They will set alarms to wake themselves every 2 hours to take Tianeptine pills so they do not go into withdrawal. Every 2 hours. Not to get high, not even to feel good, just to keep the floor from falling out. The progression had a documented shape. Researchers analysing posts on Reddit's Tianeptine communities found a consistent arc across user accounts. People typically began at something close to the label's implied dosage, 1 or 2 capsules once or twice a day. The effect was good, better than expected often. Within weeks, the same dose produced a shorter, blunter effect. They added a 3rd dose, then a 4th. The gap between doses shortened. The dose per interval increased. At some point, and this moment was different for different users, but it reliably came, the purpose of taking Tianeptine shifted. It was no longer about feeling better. It was about not feeling worse. The forum data captured this transition in the language people used. Early posts. I can't believe how much this has helped with my anxiety. I feel like myself again for the first time in years. Taking it in the morning has made such a difference. Later posts, from the same accounts or accounts describing the same arc. I've been trying to cut back and I can't get through a morning without feeling like I'm dying. Has anyone successfully tapered off this? I need to stop, but every time I try I end up back at a full dose within 24 hours. Most users, the research found, expressed a desire to discontinue. The desire was widespread and the success rate was poor. The Quitting Tianeptine subreddit had, by the time researchers were studying it, more than 5,000 subscribers, a modest number in absolute terms, but meaningful for a substance that most Americans had never heard of, and that had been on gas station shelves for less than a decade. 5,000 people who had identified themselves as wanting to stop, finding each other online, comparing notes on what worked and what didn't, asking whether buprenorphine helped with the withdrawal, sharing the schedules of their tapers, documenting the symptoms day by day. Day 3. Can't sleep, legs won't stop moving, sweating through the sheets. Day 7. Still can't eat. Day 14. Starting to feel like a person again. The post had the texture of dispatches from a shared difficulty that nobody outside the forum quite believed was real, because the thing that had caused it was sold at the same counter as the beef jerky. The forum was, in effect, a mutual aid society organised around a substance that was still being sold at the counter downstairs. The dose escalation documented in case reports is, once understood, difficult to read without a certain grim appreciation for the body's capacity to adapt. A case in the medical literature: a 38-year-old man admitted to hospital with encephalopathy, a deterioration of brain function, and unstable vital signs. He had begun using Tianeptine for cognitive enhancement and mood stabilization, at doses he had read about online. By the time he was admitted, he was taking between 8 and 20 grams of Tianeptine per day. The therapeutic antidepressant dose, for context, is 12.5 milligrams, 3 times per day, for a total daily dose of 37.5 milligrams. This man was taking somewhere between 200 and 500 times that amount, daily, the highest documented daily dose in the medical literature. He was treated with buprenorphine and naloxone, standard medication for opioid use disorder, and improved within 3 days. Buprenorphine worked because what he had was opioid use disorder. The compound was different, but the mechanism and the treatment were the same. He went home. The gas station was still open. Other cases in the literature clustered around lower but still extreme doses. A 43-year-old taking what he described as a bottle a day, roughly 3,000 milligrams, for more than a year. A 40-year-old woman with back pain who had been buying Tianeptine at a gas station and passed out at the dinner table. A man who had moved from prescription opioids to Tianeptine as a harm reduction strategy and found himself 6 months later taking both. In each case, the entry point was different. The pharmacy was always the same gas station counter. The label always said mood support. There is a specific quality to Tianeptine dependence that distinguishes it from the slower rhythms of alcohol or benzodiazepine addiction. A mechanical quality, a precision. The half-life imposes a schedule. The withdrawal onset imposes an urgency. The result was not the gradual dissolution of functioning that characterizes some addictions, but something with a tighter, more clockwork character. Users described their days as organized around dosing intervals, carrying the bottle at all times, calculating how many capsules remained and how many hours until the next dose would be needed, refusing invitations that would take them too far from a supply, planning drives, flights, work schedules around the question of access. The insomnia angle was particularly revealing. Tianeptine withdrawal can begin within hours. For a user taking high doses with a shortened interval between them, this meant that the body's demands didn't pause for sleep. The alarm clock set for 2 a.m. was not a choice. It was a medical necessity, a way of managing a withdrawal timeline that did not accommodate a full night's rest. People who had been sleeping normally before they bought that first gas station bottle were now waking in the dark, taking pills in the dark, setting another alarm, going back to sleep, waking again. What the bottle had promised was relaxation. What it had delivered, for these users, was a schedule with no days off and no negotiated terms. The substance was still classified as a dietary supplement. The label still said mood support, and the gas station was still open 24 hours, which was one thing about this situation that was genuinely convenient. None of this was secret. By the late 2010s, the documentation was accumulating in medical journals, poison control databases, Reddit threads, and emergency room reports. Physicians who encountered Tianeptine patients, often without knowing what they were treating, because the substance didn't appear on drug screens, were beginning to piece together a picture. The drug screen point deserves its own moment. Tianeptine is not detected on standard urine drug screens. Not the 5-panel, not the 10-panel, not the expanded panels used by most employers, probation offices and recovery programs. A person taking 20 grams of tianeptine daily would pass a standard workplace drug test with no flags. This was, for certain populations, the entire point. People on parole or probation who needed pain management or mood management but faced regular testing. People in formal recovery programs that included drug testing, who were trying to manage cravings without triggering a violation. People in drug-tested jobs who were self-medicating conditions they couldn't formally acknowledge. For these users, tianeptine's invisibility to standard screening was not incidental. It was the reason they chose it over alternatives. The irony was complete. A compound that was, at gas station doses, pharmacologically indistinguishable in its mechanism from the drugs these people were trying to avoid, was simultaneously invisible to the systems designed to catch those drugs. It offered the effect without the evidence. The gas station was open at 2 a.m. and the test was clean. Academic toxicologists were publishing. The CDC had flagged the escalating case counts. The FDA had sent its first warning letters, and the bottles were still on the shelves. The question that the warning letters hadn't answered, that the poison control data hadn't answered, that the medical literature hadn't answered, was simpler and harder than any of the regulatory analysis. How many people had to be found unresponsive before the mechanism was sufficient to the problem? That question was about to get some answers. The emergency rooms didn't know what they were looking at. That is the detail that gets lost in the broader arc of this story. Not the regulatory failure or the labelling fraud or the dosage gap, but the specific granular confusion of a physician standing in front of a patient who is in obvious distress and not being able to name the cause. Tianeptine withdrawal produces a presentation that is, to anyone who knows what opioid withdrawal looks like, entirely familiar. Elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, agitation, muscle pain, sweating, nausea, restless legs, the particular misery of a nervous system that has been recalibrated around a substance and is now running without it. A physician who had treated opioid withdrawal would recognize every symptom. What they would not know, in most cases, is what had caused it, because the standard drug screen would show nothing, and the patient might not know either. This was the situation that began presenting itself in Alabama emergency rooms in the late 2010s. Not a single patient, but a pattern. Multiple patients, unconnected to each other, showing up with the same constellation of symptoms, testing negative on the panels that were supposed to catch these things, reporting no known substance use or reporting only that they had been taking a supplement they bought at a gas station. The supplement was called Tiana. The patients didn't know it was the cause. The doctors didn't know to ask about it. Dr. William Rushton, a professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and director of the Office of Medical Toxicology, would later describe what his team found when they began following the trail. Tianeptine is used as an antidepressant in other countries, he said. However, the more we learned about it, it turns out that it hits the same receptors that opiates hit. The more they learned about it. That phrase carries a specific weight. It describes a process of discovery happening in real time, in an emergency room, after people were already sick. Alabama was the epicenter. Between January of 2015 and March of 2020, the Alabama Poison Information Center documented 48 cases of tianeptine intoxication or withdrawal. That may not sound like a large number, but 77% of those cases, 37 out of 48, occurred in the last 10 months of that 5-year window. The problem was not growing slowly, it was accelerating. The reason Alabama saw it first and saw it worst was geography and economics. The American South had a high density of the retail environments where tianeptine thrived. Gas stations, convenience stores, smoke shops, truck stops. It had in many areas lower access to primary care and mental health services, which made self-medication with available products more common. And it had, at that point, essentially no regulatory framework for Tianeptine at all, because no state did yet. The product had arrived and found a landscape almost perfectly shaped to receive it. The Alabama cases had a common structure that the toxicologists began to recognize. A patient would present to the emergency room in what looked like opioid withdrawal. They would test negative on the drug screen. When asked about substance use, they would often deny it, not because they were lying, but because they genuinely didn't believe they were using a substance in any meaningful sense. They were taking a supplement, a gas station supplement, something available over the counter, no prescription, on the shelf next to the B vitamins and the melatonin gummies. The idea that this product was producing opioid withdrawal was, to many of them, genuinely shocking. Some had been buying it for months, some had been buying it for years. Some had been taking escalating doses without fully registering that what they were doing was escalating, because the dose escalation happened gradually, and each individual increase felt like a reasonable adjustment to maintain an effect that had been working. Tolerance doesn't send a notification, it just quietly raises the floor. When Alabama first moved to schedule Tianeptine as a controlled substance in November of 2021, what happened next illustrated the point precisely. The ban was announced. The product disappeared from shelves in Alabama, and a population of people who had believed they were taking a dietary supplement went into opioid withdrawal. They had not known they were dependent. They had not known there was anything to be dependent on. The label said mood support. The label had said mood support the entire time. When the bottle stopped being available, the body that had been quietly restructured around its contents started issuing demands that the label had never mentioned were possible. Jonathan Morrison was 19 years old. He was a college student in Alabama, and he had a migraine. This is the beginning of the story in the most precise sense. Not a metaphor for the opioid crisis or an illustration of regulatory failure. Just a 19-year-old with a headache on an ordinary evening who stopped at the nearest gas station because gas stations are always open, and he needed something for the pain. The store was out of Excedrin. The clerk behind the counter reached for something else instead. A bottle from the supplement section, white label, capsules inside, and described it as all natural, herbal, like a powerful Tylenol. This description was the entirety of the information Jonathan Morrison received about what he was buying. There was nothing on the label to contradict it. There was no pharmacist to consult. There was no age check, no required disclosure, no moment at which the transaction paused to acknowledge that the product he was purchasing was a mu-opioid receptor agonist at doses 12 times the therapeutic antidepressant amount. The label said what all the labels said. The clerk said what the label implied. The transaction was over in less than a minute. He took it like Tylenol, multiple capsules over the course of the evening, the way you take something when you have a headache and it hasn't fully cleared yet and you think maybe you need a little more. He ate pizza rolls. At some point he went to bed. His mother, Christy Terry, and his 15-year-old sister found him the next morning. He was unresponsive. Next to him on the bed, the half-eaten plate of pizza rolls, a nearly empty Tiana bottle. Emergency services were called. He was pronounced dead. The autopsy found a Tianeptine level in his system consistent with levels documented in other fatalities. The cause of death was recorded as asphyxia, due to aspiration of gastric contents. He had choked on vomit while unconscious, a presentation associated with opioid intoxication, where the suppression of the gag reflex and the loss of consciousness can combine lethally. The Tianeptine toxicity was the mechanism, the aspiration was the consequence. 12 pills, taken as directed for a headache, across a single evening. He was 19. He had been a college student with a migraine. He had asked for Excedrin and been handed something else, by someone who had no reason to know the difference. Christy Terry did not become quiet after her son died. She became an activist, attending legislative hearings, testifying before state committees, speaking to anyone in a position of authority who would listen to her describe what had happened on that ordinary evening. He had no clue what he was taking, she said. They told him it was all natural. That sentence, its simplicity, its accuracy. The fact that it describes a lie told not necessarily out of malice, but out of genuine ignorance, which is its own kind of indictment, became the capsule version of what she was trying to explain to every committee and every legislator and every journalist she could find. What she wanted was not complicated. She wanted the product off the shelf. She wanted the sequence of events that had ended with her son dead to be structurally impossible for someone else. She wanted a system that would have told the clerk what he was handing over, or required a prescription before the bottle could be sold, or at minimum put a warning on the label that acknowledged what the capsules actually contained. None of these things would have required an extraordinary legislative intervention. They would have required treating tianeptine as what it was, a pharmaceutical compound with opioid receptor activity, not a dietary supplement for people who wanted to feel a bit better in the mornings. She also went back to the gas station. After her son was buried, she went back to the store where he had bought the bottle. She showed the clerk a photograph of Jonathan Morrison and asked if he recognised him. The clerk did not. Whether the clerk recognised him or not is in some ways beside the point. The clerk had been selling a product that was on the shelf because someone had ordered it from a distributor, who had obtained it from a manufacturer, who had imported the raw compound, put it in a capsule, and given it a name that sounded like a vitamin. The clerk had described it as all natural because that was what the label implied. The clerk had handed it over without a prescription because no prescription was required. The system had worked as designed at every point. Nobody in that chain had been asked to know what was inside the bottle. Nobody had been required to. Christy Terry was asking the clerk to account for something that the clerk had never been asked to be responsible for, which is not the same as saying he bore no responsibility, but which is an accurate description of how the system had been constructed. Morrison's case was not, by the time it became publicly known, the first Tianeptine-related death in the United States. The first documented American fatalities attributable to Tianeptine appeared in a paper published in the Journal of Analytical Toxicology in 2018. The same year, the FDA issued its first warning letters to companies marketing Tiana Red, Tiana White, and Tiana Green. The paper documented cases where tianeptine had been identified as a cause of death in autopsy toxicology. These were people who had not been known, by the people around them, to have a drug problem. Some had been known to take supplements. The supplements had tianeptine in them. The death certificates had to be revised. The FDA warning letters went to the manufacturers. The letters stated that the products were adulterated dietary supplements being marketed illegally, that tianeptine was not a dietary ingredient, that the products were unapproved new drugs, and that the companies were required to stop marketing them immediately. The letters also noted, more quietly, that the FDA had limited authority to compel compliance. The sequence the letters initiated was letter sent, company acknowledges or ignores, product rebranded or reformulated or simply continues under the same name through different distribution channels. Some manufacturers rebranded, some reformulated to technically different compounds, some continued. The shelf stayed stocked. The cases that accumulated between 2018 and 2020 formed a portrait of the full range of people the product reached, which turned out to be broader than the addiction narrative could easily contain. Not everyone who was harmed by tianeptine was dependent on it. Not everyone had been taking it for months. Some had taken it once, or a few times, not knowing what they were taking. The 40-year-old woman with chronic back pain who passed out at the dinner table had been buying tianeptine at a gas station for several months as an alternative to the prescription pain management she could no longer easily access. She had been taking it in escalating doses as the effect decreased. When she lost consciousness at the table, her family called an ambulance. She spent the night in the emergency room while the compound cleared her system. She survived and eventually recovered. She had not known she was dependent. She had been buying pain management from a gas station because pain management from a gas station was available and nothing else was. A 43-year-old man had been taking roughly a bottle a day for more than a year, approximately 3,000 milligrams daily, 80 times the therapeutic dose, and had decided he needed to stop. he began reducing his intake. The withdrawal symptoms that followed were severe enough that he could not function. He was unable to work. He was unable to sleep. The anxiety and muscle pain, and the sensation his body was in open revolt against the decision he had made, lasted long enough that he couldn't sustain the taper on his own. He required outpatient rehabilitation and a medically supervised reduction program. He had not known, when he started buying the bottles at the gas station, that stopping would require a doctor. He had not known that stopping would require anything. It was a supplement. It was on the shelf next to the melatonin. These cases, the ones involving people who were self-medicating genuine conditions with available and affordable products, without any understanding of the pharmacological mechanism of what they were taking, were in some ways the hardest to categorize. The addiction framework doesn't fully fit someone who passed out at dinner after several months of back pain management. The recreational drug use framework doesn't fit the 19-year-old with a migraine who was told it was like a powerful Tylenol. The conventional drug overdose narrative requires an understanding that you're taking a drug. Most of these people did not have that understanding because the product had been designed to prevent it. The label said mood support. The label said that for everyone. It said it for the people in opioid withdrawal who knew exactly what they were looking for. It said it for the woman with back pain. It said it for the college student with a headache. It said it for the man who'd been taking a bottle a day and didn't know stopping would require medical supervision. It made no distinctions. It offered no guidance about which of these situations was safe and which was not. It was a label on a dietary supplement, and dietary supplements did not have to say anything more than that. The national numbers continued their climb. In 2019, poison control cases involving Tianeptine more than doubled the annual average for the preceding 2 decades in a single year. In 2020, 151 cases were recorded, against 11 total in the 13 years between 2000 and 2013. The CDC documented the acceleration and published findings. The language was careful and technical, and described the situation as an emerging public health concern. The number of cases had increased by roughly 1,400% in 7 years. In the language of public health surveillance, that is an emergence. In any other language, it is a problem that has been building while the tools available to address it have remained insufficient. Alabama was ahead of the national curve, which meant it was also ahead on the legislative response. In November of 2021, the state formally scheduled Tianeptine as a Schedule I controlled substance, the same category as heroin. It was the first state to do so. Michigan followed with a Schedule II classification. The bans were real. They were also, in important ways, partial solutions to a problem that did not respect state lines, a point that would become clearer as the story moved into 2022 and 2023. Christopher Harper Montgomery died in his apartment in Mississippi in February of 2023. He had struggled with Tianeptine addiction for some time. The specific details of how he came to be using it, how long, at what doses, are not fully public. What is public is the toxicology result. Tianeptine in his system, found by the examiner who determined cause of death, and what his mother, Tracy Harper Morrison, did afterward. She lobbied. She went to the Mississippi State Legislature and told them what Tianeptine had done to her son and asked them to ban it. This was not a complicated ask. It was the same ask that Christy Terry had made in Alabama, that other families were making in other state capitals across the country. The ask was, please take this off the shelf. Please make it so that the next person who walks into a gas station with a headache, or a bad morning, or a history with opioids they're trying to leave behind, cannot walk out with something that will do what this did. Mississippi banned Tianeptine in the months following Montgomery's death. One more entry in the pattern that was becoming impossible to miss. Death, family, testimony, ban. The primary mechanism by which Tianeptine was being removed from American shelves was not regulatory foresight or preemptive federal action. It was parents going to state legislatures and explaining, in the most direct terms available to them, what the product had cost their families. Every state ban on Tianeptine through 2023 had been preceded by deaths, and followed by the testimony of people who had survived those deaths and decided the only thing left to do was make sure it happened to fewer people going forward. This is not a failure of the families. It is a description of what the families were left to do by a system that had not moved fast enough to do it first. The FDA was still writing letters. The DEA had not scheduled the substance. The shelf was still stocked in 38 states. The sequence was harm, documentation, letter, continuation. Repeat until the state legislature acted. Repeat until someone's family made them act. This was not a system designed for speed, and the thing it was dealing with moved faster than it did. By the time Mississippi banned Tianeptine following Montgomery's death, more than 20 states had still taken no action. The product that had killed him, or something functionally identical under a different name, was still available at a gas station in most of the country. The gas station was open, the shelf was stocked, and the compound that French pharmaceutical researchers had developed in the 1960s as a quiet antidepressant was still being sold, in small bottles with cheerful labels, next to the energy drinks and the lottery tickets and the beef jerky, to anyone who walked in and wanted to feel a little better. The letters kept going out, the cases kept coming in, and the question of who, exactly, had the authority and the mechanism to end this was still being answered in the same unhurried way it had been answered since the first case appeared in the poison control data more than 20 years before, which is to say, slowly and after the fact, and not before, more people were harmed. While the families were testifying and the emergency rooms were learning and the FDA was composing its letters, the people manufacturing Tianeptine products were having what appears, from the outside, to have been a reasonably good run. The business model had certain structural advantages that a legitimate pharmaceutical company could only admire from a distance. There were no clinical trials to fund, no safety studies to commission, no FDA submission process to navigate, no advisory committee hearings to prepare for, no post-market surveillance obligations to fulfill. The raw compound was available from overseas suppliers, primarily Chinese chemical manufacturers, though the supply chains were not disclosed, because nothing required them to be. It arrived as a powder. It went into capsules. The capsules went into bottles. The bottles got a label, a brand name, and a suggested retail price. The entire operation, from import to shelf, required no interaction with any regulatory body at any stage, because DSHEA had established that the regulatory interaction happened, if at all, afterward. The economics were, by the standards of the pharmaceutical industry, extraordinary. A bottle of ZaZa Red, 15 capsules, 150 milligrams each, retailed at approximately $34 at a Montclair, New Jersey convenience store. Neptune's fix ran closer to 15. The margins on both were not disclosed because nothing required them to be, but the arithmetic of a product made from an imported powder and sold at convenience store markup without the overhead of clinical development suggests they were healthy. In a single $15 bottle of Neptune's fix, a customer could purchase 3,000 milligrams of a Mu-Opioid receptor agonist, 80 times the recommended therapeutic daily dose, available with no prescription, no consultation, and no record of the transaction. The supplement industry, as a sector, has produced products that make extravagant claims while delivering the pharmacological impact of expensive water. Tianeptine was a different kind of problem. It worked. The margins were high, and the product actually did what it implicitly promised, which in the specific economics of the grey supplement market is a combination that does not stay quiet for long. The brand ecosystem that developed around Tianeptine between 2015 and 2023 was, considered on its own terms, impressively creative. ZaZa Red, Tiana Red, Tiana White, Tiana Green, Neptune's Fix, Pegasus, TD Red, Purple Magic, Red Dawn, Tianeptine Express. Different names, different packaging, different colour schemes, different claims printed on the label, some leaning into the cognitive enhancement framing, some into the relaxation framing, some making bolder claims about mood disorders or pain management or in several cases that the FDA would later specifically call out opioid use disorder. The variety served a practical function. When the FDA issued warning letters targeting specific product names, Tiana Red, Tiana White, Tiana Green, a manufacturer could respond by introducing a product with new name and marginally different formulation. The warning letter was addressed to the old product. The new product was, technically, a different product. This was not a loophole exactly. It was the logical extension of a regulatory framework that required documented harm to trigger enforcement and allowed the thing being enforced against to simply rename itself. The products were not, behind their various brand names, consistent. This was not a feature. It was an absence of any obligation to be consistent. Capsule concentrations varied between products and, in some cases, between batches of the same product. A user who had established what they understood to be their dose, the amount that maintained the effect without triggering immediate withdrawal, could buy what appeared to be the same product the following week and find the concentration substantially different. Too much, a toxic event. Too little, withdrawal onset. The label said the same thing either way. Mood support, mental clarity, the kind of language that implies a gentle, consistent, predictable effect. The product did not reliably deliver that. The manufacturers had no obligation to ensure consistency, because pharmaceutical quality control obligations did not apply to dietary supplements, and the manufacturers had successfully positioned their products as dietary supplements. The FDA had said this was wrong. The products remained on shelves. The people running these operations were not eager to be identified. When reporters from ABC News contacted Tianeptine manufacturers for comment, asking, in the basic journalistic tradition, whether they would like to respond to evidence that their products were harming people, the manufacturers declined to be identified by name. They cited in their written statements a fear of retaliation. The fear of retaliation, in this context, presumably meant the fear that being publicly identified as the company manufacturing a product linked to hospitalizations and deaths would have negative commercial consequences, which is a reasonable concern and also a fairly direct description of why public accountability for product safety exists in the first place. In the written statements they did provide, they said their products were safe. None of them signed those statements with their names. Neptune Resources LLC, the Kansas City company that manufactured Neptune's fix, did not respond to media inquiries at all. Not when the New Jersey cluster cases were being reported, not when the wrongful death lawsuits were filed, not when the CDC published its findings. MRSS Inc., manufacturer of ZaZa, and Mossad & J Distribution, its distributor, were similarly silent when the Jenkins family filed their lawsuit. These were companies operating in the vitamin aisle, with the communications posture of organizations that knew what they had made. The physical retail footprint was matched and eventually exceeded by the online market. Dedicated websites, Tianeptine.com, Tianeptinesupply.com, sold raw Tianeptine powder by the gram, not capsules, not bottles. The compound itself by weight, which allowed users to dissolve it in liquid, measure their own doses, and bypass the gas station entirely. The supplement loophole did not require a physical shelf. It required a product, a label, and a shipping address. And the internet had been providing all three at scale since the mid-2010s. In July of 2020, a search of eBay for the term ZaZa returned 4,279 listings. When the search was filtered to the supplements category specifically, 34 remained, suggesting that the majority of the listings had migrated to other categories as the name had acquired a reputation. The product was still there. It had just learned to stand in a different aisle. The question of who was paying for all of this is worth pausing on, because the answer illuminates something about the specific shape of the harm. Tianeptine was cheap, gas station cheap, available to anyone with $15, which is to say available to people who did not have access to the healthcare system's version of the same relief. Prescription antidepressants that required a doctor's visit, an insurance card, a prescription, a pharmacy. The people who were buying Tianeptine at gas stations at 2 a.m. were not, in the main, people who had a primary care physician and a working insurance plan and found the supplement aisle more convenient. They were people for whom the gas station counter was the accessible option. People in pain, back injuries, chronic conditions, the accumulated physical toll of demanding physical work, who could not easily navigate the prescription system. People with depression and anxiety who could not afford the system's version of treatment. People in recovery programs, or trying to manage cravings with something that wasn't alcohol or the drug they were trying to leave behind. This is, it bears noting, a description of some of the most economically and medically vulnerable people in the country. The product had found them with remarkable efficiency, because the gas station is where you go when the pharmacy is closed and the doctor's appointment is next month, and you need something now, and something that costs $15 and doesn't require a prescription is the thing that's available. The distribution network was not accidental. The gas station had been chosen because the gas station reached the people who had no other option. There is a version of the Tianeptine story that presents it as a drug problem, as something that happened to a population of people who were already struggling with substance use, who sought out a product that would give them a high, and who were harmed by their own choices in conditions where the harm was foreseeable. That version is not false, exactly. Some people who used Tianeptine were seeking a high, and knew, roughly, what they were doing. But it describes a fraction of the population the product reached. The woman with back pain who was buying it as a pain management strategy was not seeking a high. Jonathan Morrison was not seeking a high. He had a headache and was given something that was described to him as a powerful Tylenol. The 43-year-old who needed outpatient rehabilitation to stop taking a product he thought was a supplement was not, by any ordinary definition, someone who had knowingly entered into a high-risk drug relationship. The product had been designed to be understood as something it wasn't. The label had done that work, and the people most likely to take a gas station label at face value were the people least likely to have the pharmacological literacy to see through it, which is a way of saying they were ordinary people buying what they thought was a supplement, because that is what the label said, and there was no one in the transaction who was required to say anything different. The misconceptions that the marketing had cultivated were worth naming, because they survived well past the point when the evidence had made them untenable. Well into 2022 and 2023, people buying Tianeptine products at gas stations were operating on at least one of several false understandings. The most common was, it's natural. This was what the clerk had told Jonathan Morrison, and it was what the product's marketing implied at every level. The herbal-sounding names, the supplement framing, the language about cognitive and mood support that positioned Tianeptine alongside products made from plant extracts and vitamins. Tianeptine is not natural. It is a fully synthetic compound developed in a pharmaceutical laboratory. It does not occur in nature. There is nothing herbal about it. The word natural was not on most labels explicitly. It didn't need to be, because the entire visual and categorical context of a gas station's supplement shelf communicated it implicitly. The second misconception was, it's safe, because it's legal. This one was structurally embedded in the DSHEA framework itself. The burden of proof ran backwards. The product was on the shelf, and things on the shelf had not been removed, and things that had not been removed by the regulatory authorities were commonly understood to be within acceptable safety parameters. This is a reasonable consumer heuristic in most contexts. It did not apply here, because the regulatory authorities had repeatedly stated that the products were illegally marketed, but had been unable to act on that statement in a way that changed what was on the shelf. The third misconception, and in some ways the most consequential, was it's not addictive the way opioids are addictive. This one was held even by some people who knew they were taking a mood-altering substance, who had read about Tianeptine online, and understood in some general sense that it had pharmaceutical properties. The supplement framing had done its work at a deeper level than the label. It had placed the product in a mental category, where addiction was not a primary concern. Supplements cause side effects. Supplements can interact with medications. Supplements don't typically cause opioid withdrawal, except that this one did. The supplement shelf had been doing the work of normalizing a substance that belonged behind a prescription counter, and the normalization persisted even when the evidence of addiction was sitting in front of the person in the form of their own withdrawal symptoms. When states began banning Tianeptine, this last misconception produced something like a diagnostic moment. People who had thought they were taking a supplement suddenly couldn't get the supplement, and discovered that their bodies had formed expectations the supplement label had not mentioned were possible. They weren't addicted to a drug. They were addicted to a supplement, and then the supplement was gone, and the distinction didn't much matter. The state ban Patchwork that developed between 2021 and 2024 was in its logic correct and in its effect partial. Alabama went first, in November of 2021, scheduling Tianeptine as a Schedule I controlled substance. Michigan followed with Schedule II. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine signed an executive order in 2022. Then Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Florida, Minnesota. By 2024, 10 states had enacted bans or strict controls. The bans were real laws, carrying real criminal penalties for distribution. They were also laws that applied to physical retail within state borders and did not, in any practical sense, address the portion of the market that had migrated online. A ban in Ohio meant that a gas station in Ohio was legally prohibited from stocking Tianeptine. It meant that a manufacturer in Kansas City was prohibited from distributing to Ohio retailers. It did not mean that a website with a fulfillment center in a state without a ban could not ship a package to an Ohio address. Federal law would need to reach that. Federal law had not reached it. The patchwork created a geography of access that was, from a market perspective, almost immediately navigated. When Alabama banned Tianeptine, and the product disappeared from Alabama gas stations, users who had been buying it locally and were now in withdrawal drove to Mississippi, which had not yet banned it. When Mississippi banned it after Montgomery's death, they ordered online. The ban in each state removed the product from the most visible and accessible retail point, the gas station counter, without addressing the supply chain that filled that counter or the digital infrastructure that had already grown up alongside it. There was also the compliance problem. A ban requires enforcement, and enforcement requires that the gas station clerk knows about the ban and that the store owner has reviewed the product lineup and that someone is checking. Some stores complied immediately when their state banned Tianeptine. Others complied eventually. Others, as the story would make clear in 2023, did not comply at all. And the product sat on the shelf for more than a year after the ban, available to anyone who walked in. The marketing language that the brands had developed deserves a separate accounting, because it was doing specific and important work: mood support, mental clarity, cognitive enhancement, happiness in a bottle, superior to kratom. The language was designed to position Tianeptine products in a particular mental category, not drugs, not pharmaceuticals, not controlled substances, but wellness products, supplements, the thing your aunt takes, the thing you see on an end cap at the health food store next to the ashwagandha and the fish oil. The framing was not accidental, and it was not without effect. It shaped how purchasers understood what they were buying. It shaped how clerks described the product to customers who asked. It shaped how families understood what they found in their loved ones' medicine cabinets or nightstands. A supplement, something wellness adjacent, not something requiring the degree of alarm that would have attached to finding a prescription opioid without a prescription. The most aggressive version of this framing was the marketing to people in recovery. Several products were explicitly advertised as aids for opioid use disorder, natural alternatives that could help manage cravings, legal substitutes for the substances that had gotten out of hand. The FDA specifically and repeatedly called this claim out as dangerous and false. It was dangerous because it targeted a population with opioid tolerance and directed them toward a substance with opioid mechanism. It was false because Tianeptine does not treat opioid use disorder. It produces opioid use disorder. The distinction is significant and the marketing had deliberately obscured it. The irony, and it is a particularly complete one, is that this specific claim was the most nearly accurate of all the marketing claims made about Tianeptine. The others were vague enough to be technically defensible. Mood support doesn't specify a mechanism. Mental clarity doesn't make a pharmaceutical promise. But the opioid disorder claim was specific, and it was wrong in a specific way, and the wrongness was precisely in the direction that would cause the most harm to the most vulnerable buyers. By 2023, the landscape looked like this. 10 states had banned Tianeptine. 40 had not. The product was available online in all 50 regardless. The FDA had issued warning letters to manufacturers, warning letters to retailers, consumer warnings, import alerts, and public statements describing the products as illegally marketed and dangerous. The DEA had not scheduled the substance federally. Congress had not passed legislation. The bans that existed had been driven in almost every case by deaths that had already occurred. The manufacturers who had refused to identify themselves to journalists were still operating. The brands that had been warned by the FDA had rebranded or reformulated or continued. The shelf at the gas station in states without bans still had something near the energy drinks with a label that said mood support. The shelf at the gas station in states with bans sometimes had it too. Something was about to change. Not the regulatory architecture, or that would remain as it had been. Not the FDA's authority, that would not expand. What would change in the summer of 2023 was the severity of what was being found in the bottles, because it turned out that Tianeptine by itself had not been the whole story. Neptune's fix was a different kind of product. The earlier Tianeptine brands, Tiana, ZaZa, Tiana, were capsules in bottles, positioned on the supplement shelf, packaged to look like the kind of thing someone might buy alongside zinc and magnesium. Neptune's fix was something else. It came in a small bottle designed to look like an energy shot. 2 to 4 ounces, colourful label, the format of a product you grab from a refrigerated display next to the register and drink on your way out. It was flavoured. It was marketed under language that had escalated past the cautious mood support framing of the earlier products. Happiness in a bottle was one of the descriptions used in its promotion. Superior to kratom was another. Both claims told you something about the intended customer and how directly the product was now willing to communicate its appeal. It was distributed by Neptune Resources LLC, a Kansas City-based company that had, in the established tradition of the sector, declined to identify itself by name to journalists and declined to respond to media inquiries. The retail price was approximately $15. The bottle included a note on the label advising against use within 12 hours of kratom, a warning that was, considered in context, useful information about the kind of consumer who was buying the product, and less useful as a comprehensive safety disclosure. The bottle did not include a warning about synthetic cannabinoids. It did not include a warning about synthetic cannabinoids because, according to the label, Neptune's fix did not contain synthetic cannabinoids. The label listed Tianeptine. The bottle contained something else as well, and the label had not mentioned it. The New Jersey Poison Information and Education System had, in the years before the summer of 2023, been receiving approximately half a Tianeptine call per year. This is the background rate, the statistical baseline, the number of cases that arrived in the ordinary course of monitoring a substance that was present in the market but had not yet appeared in force in New Jersey's retail environment. Half a case a year is, for a poison control centre, a number that gets noted and filed. Between June and November of 2023, the New Jersey Poison Centre received 20 Tianeptine exposure calls from healthcare facilities. 20 calls in 5 months, against a background rate of 1 every 2 years. The calls described 17 unique patients. All 17 had presented with altered mental status. All 17 required hospital evaluation. 13 of the 17 were admitted to intensive care units. 7 of the 17 required intubation, a breathing tube placed to maintain a compromised airway, a procedure that signals the severity of what the body is doing. 1 of the 17 went into cardiac arrest. Paramedics in the field achieved return of spontaneous circulation before the patient reached the hospital. No patients in this cluster died. The range of presentations within the cluster was significant. Some patients were unconscious on arrival. Some were agitated and disoriented, unable to follow commands, unaware of where they were or why they were there. Some had cardiovascular instability, blood pressure and heart rate in ranges requiring close monitoring and intervention. The patients who required intubation had lost or were losing the ability to maintain their own airway, a condition that, without intervention, proceeds to respiratory failure and death. The patient who went into cardiac arrest had complete cessation of heart function in the field. The paramedics worked to restore it. They did. That patient survived. The cases were alarming not only in number but in severity. A background rate of half a case per year, producing cases that typically involved intoxication and withdrawal, had been replaced by a cluster producing ICU admissions and intubation and cardiac arrest. Something had changed between the Tianeptine the New Jersey Poison Center had been seeing in previous years and the Tianeptine it was seeing now. The investigation of the cluster identified Neptune's fix as the common product in the majority of cases. Samples of Neptune's fix were sent for laboratory analysis. The analysis found synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists. These are compounds that bind to the same receptors as THC, the active compound in cannabis, but with dramatically greater potency and with a safety profile that is, by any clinical measure, far worse. Synthetic cannabinoids as a class have been associated with seizure, cardiac arrhythmia, psychosis, acute kidney injury, and death. They have been sold under names like Spice and K2 in gas stations and head shops since the mid-2000s, and they have produced their own parallel public health emergency, their own cluster of emergency room visits and deaths, their own pattern of regulatory attempts and market workarounds. They are not cannabis. They are not similar to cannabis in their risk profile. They are a class of compounds for which the word dangerous is accurate in a direct and clinical sense. The history of synthetic cannabinoids in the American market is instructive precisely because it follows the same structural logic as the Tianeptine story. A class of compounds with no legitimate medical use, sold as legal alternatives to controlled substances in the same unregulated retail environments, producing severe adverse events that regulators were slow to address because each new compound required individual scheduling, and the manufacturers moved faster than the scheduling process. When one compound was scheduled, the chemists modified the molecule and produced a new one that was technically legal. The DEA has been chasing synthetic cannabinoids through this cycle since the late 2000s. The number of individual synthetic cannabinoid compounds that have been scheduled runs into the hundreds. New ones continue to appear. When synthetic cannabinoids appeared in Neptune's fix, they were not incidental background contamination. They were present in quantities that produced clinical effects serious enough to send people to intensive care units. Whether they were added intentionally to amplify the product's effect and differentiate it from competitors, or arrive through supply chain contamination was not publicly determined. What was determined was that their presence in the product was not disclosed, that the label said nothing about them, and that the people who bought Neptune's fix believing they were getting a Tianeptine product were getting something additional that they had no way to know about and no basis to consent to. The label, in this case, was not even a partial truth. It was a list of what the manufacturer had decided to tell consumers, which was not the same thing as a list of what the bottle contained. These are different things, and the regulatory framework governing dietary supplements did not require them to be the same. The label listed Tianeptine. The bottle contained Tianeptine. The bottle also contained synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists that had not been disclosed to the consumer, had not been approved for any use, and were, in the specific concentrations present in the samples, capable of producing the cardiac and respiratory events the New Jersey cluster had documented. The CDC published the cluster findings in its Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report in February of 2024. The report described 17 patients. It described the ICU admissions, the intubations, the cardiac arrest. It described the lab findings. It noted that the background rate for the New Jersey Poison Center had been 0.5 cases per year, and that the cluster had produced 20 calls in 5 months. It characterised the findings as concerning and called for increased awareness among healthcare providers. Kevin Osterhut, the medical director of the Poison Control Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, described what the adulteration finding meant for anyone consuming a Tianeptine product. "You have no idea what you're getting or how much," he said. The label was not a contract. It was at best a partial description of the contents, and at worst, a list of things the manufacturer had decided to disclose while omitting others. The adulteration of Neptune's fix was not, in the context of the unregulated supplement market, an aberration. It was an expression of the market's logic. A product manufacturer operating without pharmaceutical quality control obligations has no external requirement to verify what is in their product, at what concentration, or whether it matches the label. The supplement market has a documented history of adulteration. Products containing prescription drugs, stimulants, steroids, and other active compounds that are not listed on the label. The FDA has, over the years, found hundreds of supplements adulterated with undisclosed pharmaceutical ingredients. The most common categories are weight loss products, bodybuilding supplements, and sexual enhancement products. All of them areas where the consumer is seeking an effect the legal supplement probably can't deliver, and where an unlisted active compound can produce that effect and drive repurchase. The incentive structure rewards adulteration. The enforcement mechanism, which requires the FDA to test products after they are on the market and document harm before acting, runs consistently behind the market. In the case of Neptune's fix, whether the synthetic cannabinoids were intentional additions or contamination was not established publicly. The distinction matters in a legal and moral sense. Intentional adulteration is a deliberate fraud, while contamination is a quality control failure. But in a practical sense, for the 17 patients in New Jersey and for Chris Haggerty in Ohio, the distinction was irrelevant. The compound was in the bottle. It was not on the label. They had no way to know. The broader implication extended to every Tianeptine product on every shelf, not just Neptune's fix. Every product in the brand ecosystem, ZaZa Red, Tiana, Pegasus, TD Red, was a label backed by whatever the manufacturer had chosen to put in the capsule or the elixir, which might match the label or might not, and which might be consistent batch to batch or might not, and which the buyer had no independent way to verify. Kevin Osterhut's formulation, "You have no idea what you're getting or how much," was not a warning about Neptune's fix specifically. It was a description of every Tianeptine product, and by extension of every unregulated supplement product operating in the same market with the same absence of quality control requirements. The label was not a contract. It was, at best, a partial description of the contents, and at worst, as Neptune's fix demonstrated, a list of things the manufacturer had decided to disclose while omitting others. The consumer purchasing a product based on its label had, in this market, been given the tools to make an informed choice and stripped of the information those tools required. Chris Haggerty was 37 years old. He lived in Lorain County, Ohio, and he was in recovery from alcoholism. Recovery from alcoholism is its own kind of work. The daily management of an absence, the replacement of a habit that had organized time and feeling with something else, the specific difficulty of being around a substance you're trying not to use in a culture that surrounds itself with it. Haggerty was doing that work. He was trying not to drink. In November of 2023, he purchased a bottle of Neptune's fix from a gas station in Lorain County. Ohio had classified Tianeptine as a Schedule I controlled substance via executive order signed by Governor Mike DeWine in 2022. The executive order had the force of law. The gas station in Carlisle Township was operating in a state where Tianeptine was a controlled substance, where distributing it carried criminal penalties, where the product was banned. The product was on the shelf. More than a year had passed since the ban. The product had not been removed. Neptune's fix was marketed as a mood-altering product that promoted relaxation and happiness. It was described in its own promotional materials as happiness in a bottle. It was positioned as an alternative to substances that had caused problems, superior to kratom by its own account, and by implication preferable to alcohol for someone who was trying not to drink. The marketing was not subtle about what it was offering. It was offering the feeling of relief, available immediately at a gas station counter for $15, from something that looked like an energy shot and carried the same implicit assurance that energy shots carry. That it was a consumer product, not a pharmaceutical, and that its presence on a gas station shelf indicated some baseline level of safety. Haggerty was trying not to drink. He reached for something that was on a gas station shelf and cost $15 and told him it would help. It contained Tianeptine, at doses well above any therapeutic level. It also contained synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists that were not listed on the label. Both of those facts were unknown to him. The label said what the label had always said. There was nothing on the bottle that disclosed what Ohio law said about the product's primary compound. There was nothing that disclosed the unlisted compounds. There was nothing that connected the small, colourful shot bottle on the gas station shelf to the 17 people who'd been hospitalised in New Jersey in the preceding months, or to the ongoing FDA consumer warnings, or to the stack of warning letters the agency had been sending to manufacturers for 5 years. He had no way to know any of this. The system that was supposed to ensure he would have known, or that the bottle would not have been there when he reached for it, had not worked. Chris Haggerty died. The toxicology confirmed the toxic effects of tianeptine and the unlisted cannabinoid substances as the cause of death. He had been trying not to drink. He had bought something that the law of his state said should not have been on that shelf, from a gas station that either did not know or had not acted on that law, and it had killed him. His mother, Karen Haggerty, filed a wrongful death lawsuit. The defendants were Neptune Resources LLC, the manufacturer of Neptune's fix, and the K&B Sunoco station in Carlisle Township, where her son had purchased the bottle. The lawsuit alleged that Neptune Resources had manufactured and distributed a product it knew to be dangerous, that it had operated in a state where the product was classified as a controlled substance, and that the gas station had knowingly sold a banned substance without regard for the safety of its customers. Karen Haggerty spoke publicly about her son and about what had happened. $15, she said. How many people bought it besides my son? It was for sale at the gas station just right next to the lottery tickets and the cigarettes. My life will never be the same again. Her son had been 37. He had been in recovery. He had been trying to make a choice that kept him well, and had reached for something positioned, by its marketing and its placement and its $15 price point, as something that would help. The product had been banned in Ohio for more than a year. The gas station had not removed it. The manufacturer had not ensured its distribution network complied with state law. The distance between the law as written and the law as enforced had been, in this case, exactly the distance of a gas station shelf in Carlisle Township, and Haggerty had been on the wrong side of it. The wrongful death lawsuit named specific parties. It alleged specific conduct. It sought to assign legal accountability to the manufacturer and the retailer in a way that the regulatory framework had been unable to do on its own. This was, at this point in the story, a familiar structure. A lawsuit as the mechanism of last resort for accountability that the regulatory system had not provided. The Morrison family had pursued accountability through state legislative testimony. The Haggerty family pursued it through civil litigation. In both cases, the accountability mechanism being used was one that families had been forced to construct for themselves because the mechanisms that were supposed to operate before harm occurred had not. Neptune Resources LLC did not respond to media inquiries about the lawsuit or about its son's death. The company that had marketed happiness in a bottle signed no public statements with its name and watched its product remain on shelves in states where it had been banned, was silent. The New Jersey cluster was the most documented acute event of 2023, but it was not the only signal. The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Poison Control Center serving Pennsylvania and Delaware, received 15 reports of tianeptine poisoning in a 12-month period spanning 2023 and 2024. 15 cases in 1 year from a geographic area that had no state ban on tianeptine in effect. 9 of the 15 patients were placed on ventilators. 1 died. Pennsylvania had not banned tianeptine. The bottles were entirely legal in Pennsylvania. The 15 patients at CHOP's Poison Control Center had purchased their products legally from stores that were operating within the law as it stood in their state, and 9 of them had required mechanical ventilation, and 1 of them had not survived. The numbers from different regions and different monitoring systems were telling a consistent story. By late 2023, the product that had been described as a possible emerging public health risk by the CDC in 2020 had emerged. The emergency rooms that hadn't known what they were looking at in 2019 now had a name for it. The families who had gone to state legislatures in 2021 and 2022 had in many cases succeeded in getting bans passed. The FDA had issued warnings and import alerts and sent letters, and people were still being intubated, and people were still dying. The gap between what the regulatory system had done and what the situation required had not closed. The FDA issued a consumer warning specifically about Neptune's Fix products in November of 2023, the same month Haggerty died. The warning urged consumers not to purchase any Neptune's Fix products, and noted that laboratory testing had found the product may contain harmful ingredients not on the label. Under pressure from the warning and the accumulating legal exposure, Neptune Resources LLC agreed to a voluntary recall of Neptune's Fix products. Superchill Products, a second Neptune's Fix distributor, initiated its own recall in February of 2024. In January of 2024, the FDA took an additional step. It wrote directly to the trade associations representing convenience stores and gas stations across the country, the organizations whose members operated the specific type of retail environment where tianeptine had been sold for nearly a decade. The letter asked them to stop selling Neptune's Fix and all tianeptine products. It asked them to communicate this to their members. It provided guidance on identifying the products. The FDA used the word asked. This was not a figure of speech. The agency did not have the statutory authority to compel a convenience store chain to remove a product from its shelves without a more formal enforcement action than a letter. The letter was what was available. It was sent. It was a reasonable and appropriate use of available tools. It was also a letter asking the industry to do the right thing, which, in a situation where the industry had been selling a product linked to deaths for years, while the FDA had been asking it to stop, was a tool with a demonstrated record of partial efficacy. Neptune Resources LLC agreed to the recall. This was progress. It was also, by November of 2023, a smaller development than it might have appeared, because Neptune's Fix was one product from one manufacturer, and the tianeptine market had shown repeatedly the capacity to absorb the removal of any individual product and continue with different brands, different names, different labels saying the same things. The recall addressed Neptune's Fix. It did not address ZaZa Red. It did not address Tiana. It did not address the raw powder being sold online. The shelf in 40 states was still stocked. The online market was still open. A 20-year-old in Pennsylvania had bought 2 bottles of ZaZa at a local mini-mart in October of 2023, before the Neptune's Fix recall, before the FDA's consumer warning, before any of the events of November had occurred. Her name was Lena Jenkins, and that is the next part of this story. The Neptune's Fix recall addressed Neptune's Fix. This sounds obvious, and it is, but the obviousness is the point. The recall that Neptune Resources LLC initiated under FDA pressure in late 2023 applied to the specific products that Neptune Resources manufactured and distributed. It did not apply to ZaZa Red. It did not apply to Tiana. It did not apply to Pegasus or TD Red or any of the other brands in the ecosystem that shared a compound but not a manufacturer. The FDA's January 2024 letter to gas station and convenience store trade associations asked the industry to stop selling all tianeptine products, not just Neptune's fix, all of them. And the letter was a request, not a compulsion, and the shelf in 40 states was stocked with products the recall had not touched. The recall was progress, the problem was general, and the recall was specific, and the distance between those two things was the space in which the next part of this story had already happened. Lena Jenkins was 20 years old. She was from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and she loved art. These details, her age, her home county, what she loved, are the details that her family shared publicly, because they are the details that make a person, rather than a case number in a poison control database. She was 20. She was from Bucks County. She loved art. On October 7th, 2023, she bought 2 bottles of ZaZa Red at the Q-Town Mini Mart near her home. 15 capsules per bottle, 30 capsules total, each containing 150 milligrams of Tianeptine, for a combined purchase of 4,500 milligrams of a Mu-Opioid receptor agonist, available for approximately $30 at a mini-mart with no prescription requirement and no warning on the packaging. Pennsylvania had no ban on Tianeptine. The Q-Town mini-mart was operating within the law. The product on its shelf was legal. The packaging said what all the packaging said: dietary supplement, the supplement facts panel, the language about mood support and mental clarity, and the kind of health claims that trigger no regulatory scrutiny, because the regulatory framework for supplements does not scrutinize health claims before they go on the label. There was nothing on the packaging about opioid receptor activity. There was nothing about addiction risk. There was nothing about withdrawal. There was nothing about the FDA's position that the product was an illegally marketed drug. There was nothing about the 17 people who had been hospitalized in New Jersey in the preceding months, or the warnings that had been issued, or the recall that was about to happen for a different product from a different manufacturer. There was mood support. There was mental clarity. There was the categorical implication of the supplement shelf, which was that the product had been through some process that made it appropriate to sell to anyone who walked in and handed over $30. Lena Jenkins was 20 years old, from Bucks County, an art lover. Those facts are complete. They do not require embellishment, and they resist it. She was at the beginning of a life, doing what a 20-year-old does, making ordinary purchases at local stores, coming home, going about the business of being 20. And the store where she bought 2 bottles of something that the label called a dietary supplement was operating legally, and the product on its shelf was legal, and there was nothing in the transaction that marked it as different from buying vitamins. On October 8th, 2023, she was found unconscious. She died that day. The cause of death was tianeptine toxicity. She was 20 years old. She had been home the night before. She had bought what the label said was a dietary supplement. She had not woken up. Her mother, Angela Roos, filed a wrongful death lawsuit. The defendants were MRSS Inc., the manufacturer of ZaZa Red, Mossad and J Distribution, the distributor, and the Q-Town Mini Mart where Lena had purchased the bottles. The lawsuit alleged that the manufacturer had made a product it knew to be dangerous, that the distributor had placed that product in retail environments without adequate warning, and that the store had sold a product that was causing harm in documented cases to a customer who had no way of knowing the risk. Angela Roos's attorney, Douglas DeSandro, described the family's position on why the lawsuit was necessary and what it was intended to accomplish. Companies in this type of industry, he said, often do not heed warnings or follow guidance unless lawsuits and money get involved. That's really the only thing that makes these companies change their ways. This was not an argument that the legal system was the ideal mechanism for addressing a public health problem. It was an acknowledgement that the legal system was the mechanism that remained available. The FDA had heeded warnings and issued letters and made no change in what was on the shelf in Pennsylvania. The DEA had not acted. Congress had written letters. The state of Pennsylvania had not yet passed a ban. The Q-Town Mini Mart had sold the bottles legally. The lawsuit was the instrument that could reach where the regulatory framework had not reached. It could name the manufacturer. It could name the distributor. It could name the store. It could put specific parties in a process that required them to respond, to produce documents, to account for decisions, a level of institutional accountability that no letter from the FDA had been able to compel. Angela Roos's stated goal was not money. It was the same goal that every family in this story had stated. She wanted the product off the shelf. She wanted the transaction that had killed her daughter to be structurally impossible for someone else's daughter. The lawsuit was the tool that was available. She used it. MRSS Inc. and Mossad and J Distribution did not respond publicly to the lawsuit. The pattern of families becoming the primary accountability mechanism had by 2024 become one of the defining structural features of the Tianeptine crisis in the United States. Morrison's family had gone to the Alabama legislature. The testimony had contributed to the state ban. Montgomery's family had gone to the Mississippi legislature. Mississippi had banned the product within months of his death. Haggerty's family had filed a civil lawsuit against the manufacturer and the gas station. Jenkins's family had filed a civil lawsuit against the manufacturer, the distributor, and the store. Each action was targeting a different node in the supply chain. Each family had stated, in terms that required no interpretation, that money was not the primary goal. The goal was removal. What this meant in practice was that the enforcement of product safety in the Tianeptine market was being carried out by grieving families in state legislative hearings and civil courtrooms, using the mechanisms that exist for accountability after harm rather than the mechanisms that are supposed to prevent harm in the first place. The families were doing, at significant personal cost and in the context of devastating loss, work that a proactive regulatory framework would have done before anyone died. To be precise about what this involved, testifying at hearings requires appearing in public, in a formal setting, while managing grief, to describe to strangers the details of how someone they loved died. Filing a wrongful death lawsuit requires retaining legal counsel, organising documentation, committing to a process that will take years and expose the details of a family's loss to discovery and deposition. Going back to the gas station and showing the clerk a photograph of the person who died there requires going back to the gas station. None of these things are easy. None of them are things a family should have to do as the primary mechanism by which a dangerous product gets removed from a shelf. The families were not wrong to pursue these avenues. They were doing what was available to them. What the pattern describes is not a failure of the families, but a description of what they were left with when the systems that were supposed to act first had not. Congress noticed. This is perhaps the most accurate statement that can be made about the federal legislative response. In early 2024, a bipartisan group of 5 House members sent a letter to the FDA Commissioner urging the agency to consider reclassifying Tianeptine under the Controlled Substances Act. Reclassification under the CSA would bring Tianeptine under DEA jurisdiction and give federal authorities the scheduling power that would allow them to act at the federal level rather than waiting for individual states to move one at a time. The letter was bipartisan, which indicated that the political dimensions of the supplement regulatory debate, which has historically tracked partisan lines, with deregulatory preferences on one side and consumer protection priorities on the other, had, in the specific case of a compound killing people in gas stations, become less important than the compound killing people in gas stations. The FDA responded that it had issued warning letters and would continue to collaborate with federal partners. The DEA did not schedule Tianeptine. The congressional letter had asked a question. The FDA's response had described what it had already done. The DEA's response was silence. The scheduling process has specific statutory and procedural requirements. It is not something an agency can do in response to a congressional letter the way a department can change a policy in response to a complaint. But the absence of federal scheduling, by 2024, after years of documented harm, after multiple deaths, after ICU clusters and wrongful death lawsuits and state-level bans across 10 states, was notable not as a bureaucratic failure, but as a description of how the process was designed. Slowly, deliberately. with documentation requirements that, by design, accumulated after the harm rather than before it. The legislative landscape in 2024 looked like this: 10 states with bans or strict controls: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Ohio, Tennessee, pending legislation in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, North Carolina, Illinois, and others. Every state that had banned Tianeptine had followed the same sequence. Poison control cases spike. Coroner flags deaths. Families testify. Legislature acts. The federal government, which had the authority to resolve the patchwork with a single scheduling decision, had not acted. The patchwork had a specific cost that the aggregate numbers didn't fully capture. A user in Alabama who had become dependent on Tianeptine before the state ban could drive to Georgia to purchase it, until Georgia banned it. They could drive to Tennessee, until Tennessee banned it. They could order online from states that hadn't banned it. They could order from websites that operated across state lines, with no mechanism to enforce state-level bans on shipping. The bans removed the most visible and accessible retail point, the local gas station, without addressing the underlying availability. Pending legislation in Pennsylvania meant that Lena Jenkins had bought her bottles legally, from a legal retailer, under a legal regulatory framework that had not yet caught up to the documented harm in her state. The 15 cases at CHOP's Poison Control Centre, 9 ventilated, 1 dead, had all occurred in states where the product was legal. The law was working as written. It was working in exactly the way that a reactive regulatory framework works, responding to harm rather than preventing it, and taking the time that responsive processes take. In the spring of 2024, something happened that was, in the particular context of this story, almost poetically complete. The supplement industry wrote a letter. Major supplement industry trade associations, the organizations that represent the manufacturers, distributors, and retailers of dietary supplements in the United States, and whose lobbying efforts had helped produce the regulatory framework that allowed Tianeptine to occupy the supplement shelf for a decade, wrote to Senator Dick Durbin confirming that their members did not sell Tianeptine, that it did not belong in dietary supplements, and that the FDA should use its available authorities to remove these products from the market. Lauren Israelson, president of the United Natural Products Alliance, put it in terms that were, given the history, remarkable. "We can persuade," he said. "We can encourage. We can inform, but we can't regulate." This admission requires a moment. The United Natural Products Alliance and similar trade bodies had, in 1994, been part of a lobbying effort that successfully prevented the FDA from requiring pre-market safety approval for dietary supplements. The argument then had been that supplements were not drugs, that the FDA was overreaching, that consumers had the right to access vitamins and herbal products without the agency's permission. Congress agreed. The framework that resulted was the one Tianeptine had exploited. Now, 30 years later, the same industry was writing to the Senate to say, "We can't regulate our own market. Please do it for us." The products that were harming people were not. The trade associations were careful to note products their members made. Their members were responsible companies. The problem was that the loophole they had lobbied into existence did not include a mechanism for distinguishing between the responsible companies and the ones importing synthetic pharmaceutical compounds and selling them next to the beef jerky. The loophole was a loophole. It opened for everyone who fit through it. We can persuade, we can encourage, we can inform, but we can't regulate. This was, finally, the frank acknowledgement of what the regulatory architecture built in 1994 had always contained. An absence where the mechanism for protecting consumers was supposed to be. The industry had asked for that absence. It had gotten it. And the absence had been found, predictably, by the people who were looking for it. The wrongful death cases were, by late 2024, proceeding through the legal system at the pace that civil litigation proceeds, which is to say, slowly and with no guaranteed outcome. Discovery, document requests, depositions. The process of establishing in a legal proceeding what had been established in the public record years earlier, that the product contained what it claimed to contain and what it didn't claim to contain, that the manufacturers knew or should have known the harm it could cause, that the retailers had sold a product that was dangerous and in some cases had sold it in states where it was banned. The families who had filed these lawsuits had been asked by journalists and advocates whether they were seeking financial compensation. The answers had been consistent. The Morrison family, the Haggerty family, the Jenkins family. None of them had said money was the point. All of them had said the point was the shelf. The point was that the product should not be on the counter when the next person walked in with a headache, or a bad morning, or a history with substances they were trying to leave behind. The lawsuits were moving. The shelf, in most of the country, was still stocked. The two timelines, the speed of civil litigation and the speed of retail availability, were not moving at the same pace, and the gap between them was the space in which the story was still happening. Tracy Harper Morrison, the mother of Christopher Harper Montgomery, who had died in Mississippi in February of 2023, went back to the store where her son had bought the product. She showed the clerk his photograph. She asked if the clerk recognized him. The clerk did not. She had already been to the legislature. Mississippi had already passed the ban. She went to the store anyway. There is something in that action. After the ban, after the testimony, after the legislation had been passed, and the product had been removed from that specific shelf. That is worth sitting with. It is not a policy action. It is not an accountability mechanism. It is not something that will change the regulatory landscape, or accelerate federal scheduling, or close the loophole that allowed the product to be sold in the first place. It is a mother going back to the place where the transaction happened, and showing a face to someone who never knew there was a face involved. The clerk had sold a product. The product had been on the shelf. The company that put it on the shelf had declined to be publicly identified. The regulatory framework that allowed it to be on the shelf had been designed in 1994 by people who had other things in mind. None of these facts reached the clerk at the counter. The clerk had handed over a bottle and taken a payment, and the transaction had been complete. And somewhere else, a family had been altered permanently, and the clerk behind the counter had not known and had not been required to know. Tracy Morrison showed him the photograph. He did not recognize her son. The counter doesn't know what it's selling. In most places, it's not required to. The story of what that looked like, and what had and hadn't changed by the time the most recent deaths were recorded, is where this ends. The lawsuits were moving through the legal system. The shelf was still stocked. These two facts existed simultaneously in 2024 and continued to exist simultaneously into 2025, and the distance between them, the gap between accountability proceeding at the pace of civil litigation and a product remaining available at a gas station counter while that litigation proceeded, is perhaps the most accurate single image of what the regulatory architecture had produced. The courts move slowly. The shelf is open 24 hours. The wrongful death cases involving the Morrison family, the Haggerty family and the Jenkins family were all in various stages of discovery and pretrial process. Documents were being produced, depositions were being scheduled. The legal machinery was doing what legal machinery does, building slowly and methodically toward a determination of whether the specific parties named had specific legal liability for specific harms. This is not a criticism of the legal process. The legal process is designed to do exactly this. The criticism, if there is one, is that a legal process that begins after people have died is a different kind of mechanism than a regulatory process that prevents people from dying. And in this story, the regulatory process had consistently arrived after the fact, and the legal process had been left to follow. The families had filed, the defendants had been served, the shelf was still stocked. The federal scheduling question remained, in 2025, exactly where it had been for years, in a process that had not concluded. The DEA schedules controlled substances under the Controlled Substances Act based on several factors: the potential for abuse, the existence or absence of legitimate medical use in the United States, and the safety of the substance under medical supervision relative to its abuse potential. The scheduling process is not quick. It involves formal notice and comment periods, evaluations by the DEA and the FDA, in some cases public hearings, and a determination that moves through multiple levels of the federal bureaucracy before a substance is formally assigned to a schedule. This process is slow by design. The design reflects a deliberate judgment that the power to restrict a substance should not be exercised lightly or quickly, because the consequences of overscheduling are also real and also affect people who need access to legitimate medicines. The design made sense for the cases it was designed for. It made less sense when applied to a compound that had been classified as a narcotic in France in 2012, that had produced a documented record of hospitalizations and deaths in the United States for more than a decade, that had been the subject of FDA warning letters since 2018, and that was still available on gas station shelves while the process was ongoing. The scheduling process was not failing. It was working as designed. The design had not anticipated this specific situation. The DEA had, in previous years, used emergency scheduling provisions to rapidly classify compounds when the evidence of harm was acute and immediate. Synthetic cannabinoids, the same class of compounds found in Neptune's fix, had been emergency scheduled multiple times as new variants appeared. The Emergency Scheduling Authority exists and has been used. It had not been used for Tianeptine. Why not has not been publicly explained in specific terms. The most plausible reconstruction involves the complicating factor of Tianeptine's status as a foreign-approved pharmaceutical. Unlike synthetic cannabinoids, which have no legitimate medical use anywhere, Tianeptine is an approved prescription drug in more than 60 countries. Its clinical record as an antidepressant is real. Scheduling it as a controlled substance with no accepted medical use, Schedule 1, raises different considerations than scheduling a compound that has never been used medically anywhere. The DEA had declined to make that determination publicly, and the determination had not been made. The result was that a compound with a documented record of hospitalizations, dependency, and death in the United States remained unscheduled at the federal level, while 10 states had individually arrived at the judgment that it warranted Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 classification. The states had each made their own determination that the evidence was sufficient. The federal agency charged with making that determination nationally had not. The FDA had used a different tool, the import alert. In 2022, the agency placed Tianeptine on import alert, a designation that instructed customs officials to detain shipments of Tianeptine at the border as a product that was being illegally marketed in the United States. The import alert was a meaningful step. It made the supply chain more difficult. It did not stop the supply chain. Raw Tianeptine powder that entered the country before the alert, or through shipments that were not flagged, or through the channels that the supplement industry has historically used to move product across borders, remained in the market. The import alert was, like the warning letters and the consumer advisories, a tool aimed at the problem that the available authorities permitted. The problem, as the continuing cases demonstrated, had not been fully addressed by the available authorities. In May of 2025, FDA Commissioner Martin Makary addressed the Tianeptine situation publicly. "I'm very concerned," he said. "I want the public to be especially aware of this dangerous product and the serious and continuing risk it poses to America's youth." The FDA was closely following distribution and sales, he noted. The agency was committed to working with federal partners to address the problem. He did not announce federal scheduling. He did not announce a new enforcement authority. He did not announce any legal mechanism that the FDA had not already used. He said the agency was very concerned and was closely following distribution. This was 7 years after the FDA's first warning letters. It was 4 years after Alabama had made its own determination that the evidence was sufficient for Schedule 1 classification. It was 2 years after the New Jersey ECU cluster, after the deaths of Chris Haggerty and Lena Jenkins and Christopher Harper Montgomery. It was the FDA commissioner saying, in the official register of a federal agency head, that he was very concerned. The available tools had been used, the warning letters had gone out, the import alert was in place, the consumer advisories had been published, the recall had been initiated, the letters to the trade associations had been sent. All of this had happened. More tools required either new legislation giving the FDA new authority over dietary supplements, which would require Congress to revisit DSHEA, which the supplement industry would oppose even while its trade associations were writing letters saying it couldn't regulate itself, or DEA scheduling, which had not happened. Commissioner Macary's statement was accurate and appropriate given the constraints on what the FDA could do. The constraints on what the FDA could do were the problem. The statement was added to the record. The record was already long. A Western Pennsylvania woman died of Tianeptine overdose in 2025. Pennsylvania had not banned Tianeptine. The product was legal to purchase in her state. The details of her case, her name, her age, how she came to buy Tianeptine, what she knew about what she was taking, were not fully public. What was public was the fact. A woman in Western Pennsylvania died of Tianeptine toxicity in 2025 in a state where the product was legal, while the FDA commissioner was expressing concern and the DEA had still not scheduled the compound. She is the most recent death in the documented record of this story. She is not, in any likelihood, the last. Pennsylvania had pending legislation at the time of her death. Whether that legislation would pass and whether passing it would be sufficient, and whether the online market would simply absorb the users who could no longer buy the product at a local gas station, all of these questions were open. What was not open was whether the product had continued to cause harm while the legislative response was still pending. It had. It was doing so at the moment she died. The question of what would be sufficient to stop this is one that the story has been building toward for 7 parts, and does not, honestly, have a clean answer. The state bans had worked in the specific sense that they had removed the product from physical retail in 10 states. They had not worked in the larger sense that they had not ended the availability of the compound to people who wanted it. The federal scheduling that would address the problem at a national level had not happened. The supplement regulatory reform that would give the FDA pre-market authority had not happened, and the political constituency for it faced the same industry opposition in 2025 that it had faced in 1994. The lawsuits were proceeding. The families were still waiting for outcomes. The shelf in 40 states was still a possibility. The compound that French pharmaceutical researchers developed in the 1960s as a modest antidepressant is, 60 years later, still in French pharmacies, prescribed by doctors, dispensed in 28-day supplies, monitored by the apparatus of a controlled substance classification that France put in place in 2012, when it became clear that the compound's opioid receptor activity made unrestricted access a problem. In France, getting Tianeptine requires a physician who has decided it is appropriate for a specific patient, a prescription that can be filled once and in limited quantity, and a pharmacist who will dispense it and who is part of a system that tracks prescriptions and flags unusual patterns. The system is not perfect. Doctor shopping occurred in France before the tightening, and controlled substance regulations are worked around everywhere. But the system creates friction between the compound and the person who wants it, and friction matters. Friction is the difference between the number of people who walk into a gas station on a bad night and the number of people who call a doctor's office the next morning. In the United States, as of 2025, getting Tianeptine may require a web browser and a credit card, or it may require a car if you live in one of the 40 states where a gas station near you still has it on the shelf. Or it may require knowing the right name, because the compound cycles through brand names the way a product in regulatory trouble cycles through brand names, which is to say, continuously, staying one step ahead of whatever specific name the last warning letter addressed. The compound hasn't changed. It binds to the same receptors it has always bound to. It produces the same effects at the same doses that it has always produced. The half-life is the same. The withdrawal timeline is the same. The alarm clock at 2 in the morning is the same. The ICU presentation is the same. The label is different. The label is always different. The compound is the same. Tonix Pharmaceuticals, a specialty pharmaceutical company, had been developing a once-daily formulation of Tianeptine for clinical use in the United States. The theory was straightforward. Bring the compound through the legitimate pharmaceutical approval process, establish a controlled clinical context for its use, create a version of Tianeptine that could be prescribed by physicians, dispensed by pharmacists, monitored at therapeutic doses, with the full apparatus of pharmaceutical regulation applied to its distribution. The formulation under development used a lower dose than the products being sold at gas stations, in a controlled release format designed to reduce the abuse potential that came from the rapid onset and short half-life of the over-the-counter products. This path would not have solved the supplement market problem directly. A legitimate pharmaceutical approval for Tianeptine in the United States would not have pulled ZaZa Red from the shelf in Alabama, but it would have done something important. It would have given Tianeptine an official pharmaceutical identity in the United States, which would have strengthened the FDA's authority to act against products marketing the same compound without approval, and it would have given the DEA a clearer factual basis for the medical use determination that the scheduling analysis required. The ambiguity about whether Tianeptine had any legitimate American medical context would have been resolved. The Phase 2 clinical trial results arrived in October of 2023. They were disappointing. The formulation did not demonstrate the efficacy that would have justified proceeding to Phase 3. Tonix discontinued the development program. The legitimate pharmaceutical path closed. The supplement market path remained open. The compound that had been a prescription antidepressant in France for 40 years had, in the specific legal architecture of the United States, no sanctioned clinical identity, only the identity the supplement label gave it, which was mood support, which had been doing the work of keeping it on shelves while the regulatory response spent a decade trying to catch up. What DSHEA was designed to do in 1994 was protect consumer access to vitamins, minerals, herbs, and other dietary substances from what the supplement industry characterized as FDA overreach. The industry had been concerned that the agency was moving toward requiring pre-market approval for supplements, approval that would have treated fish oil capsules and vitamin C tablets with the same regulatory scrutiny as pharmaceutical drugs, a requirement that the industry argued was disproportionate to the risk profile of the products in question. The industry's argument was not unreasonable. Vitamins and herbal supplements, in their typical forms, are not the same category of risk as pharmaceutical drugs. The regulatory framework built in 1994 reflected a genuine judgment about where to draw that line. The judgment turned out to have a flaw that was not perhaps obvious in 1994. It had no mechanism for handling a case in which a foreign pharmaceutical drug, not a vitamin, not an herb, but a fully synthetic compound with decades of clinical use as a prescription antidepressant and a mechanism of action that included opioid receptor agonism, decided to describe itself as a dietary supplement and place itself on a gas station shelf. The framework had been built to protect supplements from being treated as drugs. It had accidentally also protected a drug from being treated as a drug. The burden of proof ran backwards. The harm arrived first. The poison control data followed the harm. The medical literature followed the data. The FDA warning letters followed the literature. The state bans followed the deaths. The lawsuits followed the state bans. The congressional letters followed the lawsuits. The supplement industry's own admission that it couldn't regulate itself followed the congressional letters. The FDA commissioner's statement of very serious concern followed all of that. And through all of it, through the warning letters since 2018, through the deaths since at least 19, through the ICU clusters and the wrongful death lawsuits, and the state legislatures, and the bipartisan congressional requests, through all of it, the compound had remained available, on shelves in 40 states, online in all 50, $15, no prescription, no age check, no warning about what it does to the nervous system if you take it for long enough, or what happens if you stop. At every stage, the action came after the fact. At every stage, the action came after someone had been found unconscious, or admitted to the ICU, or intubated, or given a death certificate. The system was not designed to move before that happened. It was designed to move after. In most circumstances, that design produces outcomes that are acceptable, because most of the substances occupying the supplement shelf are not synthetic opioid agonists disguised as cognitive enhancers. The circumstance the design had not prepared for was a synthetic opioid agonist disguised as a cognitive enhancer, and that circumstance had been present and documented for more than a decade. The gas station is still there, the fluorescent lights are still on, the coffee is still burnt, the rotating hot dog, the one that may have been there since the Obama administration, is still rotating. Someone is still arguing with the lottery machine at 3 a.m. The country song is still playing quietly above the refrigerators. In 10 states, the shelf beside the energy shots and the nicotine gummies no longer has a bottle with a label that says mood support. In 10 states, a law was passed. In every case after deaths had occurred, in every case after families had testified, in every case after the evidence had accumulated to the point where a state legislature could no longer reasonably decline to act. The bans are real. The shelves in those 10 states are clear of this particular product. In 40 states, the shelf may still have something that says ZaZa or Tiana, or some newer name that the compound has acquired since the last warning letter. The shelf may have nothing, because the retailer has been paying attention, or because the distributor has pulled back in anticipation of pending legislation, or because the specific product that was there last week is in a warehouse, while a reformulated version is being prepared, or the shelf may have a bottle. In 40 states, that is a legal possibility. Online, in all 50 states, a person can still search for Tianeptine and find it. The bans that exist apply to physical retail. They do not apply to a website. A person in Alabama, which has had a Schedule 1 ban since 2021, can, if they look, find Tianeptine available for purchase and shipping. A person in any state can find it. The shelf is no longer only at the gas station. The shelf is also a web browser at 2 a.m, and the counter is a payment form, and the transaction is as simple as it has always been. The bottle still says mood support. It still says mental clarity. It still says relaxation. It still says the kind of language that implies something wellness adjacent, something your body needs, something that will make the next few hours better than the ones that preceded them. The label has not changed. The label was never the problem, precisely. The problem was what the label was allowed not to say. The compound that French pharmaceutical researchers developed in the 1960s as a modest antidepressant is, 60 years later, still in French pharmacies, prescribed by doctors, dispensed in 28-day supplies, monitored by the apparatus of a controlled substance classification that France put in place in 2012. In France, getting Tianeptine requires a physician who has decided it is appropriate, and a pharmacist who will dispense it, and a system that records the prescription and flags multiple prescriptions from different doctors to the same patient. In the United States, as of 2025, getting Tianeptine may require a web browser and a credit card, or it may require a car if you live in one of the 40 states where a gas station near you still has it on the shelf, or it may require knowing the right name, because the compound cycles through brand names the way a product in regulatory trouble cycles through brand names, which is to say, continuously, staying one step ahead of whatever specific name the last warning letter addressed. The compound hasn't changed. It binds to the same receptors it has always bound to. It produces the same effects at the same doses that it has always produced. The half-life is the same. The withdrawal timeline is the same. The alarm clock at 2 a.m. is the same. The ICU presentation is the same. The label is different. The label is always different. The compound is the same. The counter doesn't know what it's selling. In 10 states, the counter is no longer selling it. In 40 states, it might be. Online, it is. Nobody in that transaction, not the counter, not the website, not the shipping label, is required to know what it is. Nobody in that transaction is required to tell the person purchasing it what they are purchasing, or what their body will do with it over the weeks and months that follow, or what it will cost to stop. The label says mood support. The label says it will help. And somewhere right now it is on a shelf in a gas station that is open 24 hours, and someone is walking in, and they have $15, and the thing they need most in the world at this particular moment is to feel a little better. The bottle is there. The bottle has always been there, and the system that was supposed to have moved it before anyone reached for it had a sign on the door that said we'll deal with it after. It is still dealing with it.